Thanks, Swapnil. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm excited to meet everyone here. Um, so my topic is about the documentation product owner, and through the slides, I will try to talk to what I have learned over with my experiences and uh, learned over time. I'm Shreya, and I'm a technical writer working with the developer relations team at Clover Networks. Clover is a point of sale system. We sell hardware to small and medium businesses in the US, like in the North America region, and we're slowly expanding in EU and other regions. Me and 3 other technical writers manage the developer documentation for Clover's third-party developers. We also have a content design team who support the merchant-facing help. I'll talk a little bit about what that means. Before Clover, I worked at Oracle. I was there for over 10 years. I was based out of Hyderabad in India. My team managed documentation and training for project portfolio management products. Outside of work, I volunteer with the Environmental Volunteers based in Palo Alto in California. Environmental volunteers create supplemental elementary school curriculum and help kids build scientific thinking and fact-finding skills. And I really enjoy that, and it's my passion. So that's enough about me. All right. At Clover, my team owns the entire documentation set for third-party developers who build apps for Clover's App Market. I'll talk a little bit about the app market in the next slide. The areas that I fundamentally manage are the developer platform. Clover has an Android-based platform based on which developers can build apps. There are different kinds of apps that they can build. And I also own the billing docs. At Oracle, I was part of the cloud ERP team. My team managed SOAP and REST API guides, business-focused documentation. My team also had UX writers. We reviewed the UI text, the language on the UI, and also curriculum developers who created training on our product for sales enablement for Oracle University overall. A quick look into Clover's app market. What is this app market? It's similar to the App Store, the Apple App Store, or the Google Play Store, but it's focused on the payments industry and on our third-party developers, giving them the ability to build additional solutions that supplement small and medium businesses. So a restaurant owner can use one of the apps to check in and check out their employees, or they can take an order at the counter and they can push that order to the kitchen printer and print the order for the chef so that they can start preparing the order. So this and many other kinds of solutions can be built. And as a documentation team, as a developer documentation team, we realize that this is the end goal of what we're trying to accomplish. So the developer platform at Clover enables developers to build these apps based on different solutions, create and extend the functionality that comes out of the box from the hardware devices that we sell. To this topic, why be a doc product owner? Isn't doc part of the product? Absolutely. Doc starts all the way from the product UI to the external site, to the API reference, all of that. But why do I need to think about being a doc product owner? How has it helped me? The first thing I have learned over time is to make impact. How do you make impact with docs? By having effective documentation that answers customer questions, I can help reduce support costs. I can help customers succeed using the functionality more easily. That includes even like having helpful messages on the UI, having meaningful labels, them knowing how to navigate, how to go around the product, to actually searching for help and looking for documentation on how to execute a certain task. Increasing customer satisfaction by helping them complete their tasks successfully, succeeding in their business, can help drive up renewals of the product. So overall, you can have, if not direct, but indirect impact on revenue. However, what about the team? How does the team benefit from this? You can increase the visibility of the team in the organization by showing your contributions and to improving documentation to help customers, to drive up revenue, and being able to communicate this vision via a roadmap, which I'll talk to a little bit later. Also, the more your stakeholders and partners within the internal teams start to see your enthusiasm in listening to customers and improving the quality of your documentation, they get more engaged. They're excited to give you information. They participate in your reviews, and you have a nice collaborative and effective relationship with these team members. Last but not the least, measuring your contributions to organizational objectives. That is the bigger picture of how the team gains. A quick look and a step back into challenges. These were the things that came to the top of my mind, but I'm sure that many of you would come up with your own list of things. Like, these are the first few things I could think of. Stale documentation, we all have that. Incomplete documentation, stuff that we built many years ago. We didn't know the product well enough, and now we know it, but we don't have the time to go back and fix it. Hard to find the answer. Sometimes I know the help is there. I don't understand why a customer could not find it when I can find it. Organization of my content sometimes may not reflect the user's workflow. Maybe it needs a little bit of a step back into looking at the audience's workflow, studying what they're really doing with the application. All of this needs time, prioritization, staffing, all of these things. Dockside capabilities. Our site has been there for a while, but there are things that we would love to fix. Sometimes customers have reported issues, and we haven't had the time to go back and look at that. What about the new features, the actual new features that your product is building? The doc improvements that are coming via support tickets, via your stakeholders, via people who, like, I'm part of the developer relations team. We get lots of questions from developers on how they can do stuff, on what is the, excuse me, on the issues they're facing and the questions they have. In general, having all this can overwhelm a technical writer and make your processes ineffective and inefficient, and can lead to writers being seen as expendable. Flipping the story, let's start thinking, if we start thinking about this whole thing as a product owner and taking ownership of all of this. I have all these different things I want to do. If my doc was a product, I look at it holistically. Begin gathering data about key customers. How many of them, how many customers are impacted by the features or the list of problems in your queue? What is the frequency of use of these features? Are there some problems that are more severe than others? Do some of the issues impact revenue? Like, they're not able to complete some steps. You have a complex application. You could essentially build out a good example to help them through this. Next, categorize the issues. For example, you may have site usability issues, new features, bug fixes, whatever is suitable or meaningful to your organization. You can create your own categories. Estimating the effort, that's a great way to identify how much time it's going to take you to make these fixes. And also, if needed, provide data to your management for staffing, or if you need the support of another team member to accomplish this. Creating and prioritizing your backlogs, actually like a product owner would. Thinking about what is the minimum viable product in some cases. An example of the day in the life of you as a doc product owner. You have a new feature request. Let's assume it's an online ordering API, needs a whole reference, tutorials, data model, tips. It could be a whole bunch of things. A new feature is coming up. It's part of an existing workflow, but here's a new feature called, it's metered billing, because I own billing. And this feature can actually help developers make more money, help us make more money. That's another feature that's in there. Since we are also a hardware company, we sell hardware to merchants and sometimes have to send communications about these hardware launches to our developers so that they can prepare their apps and test their apps ahead of time to make it ready to successfully work when a merchant is able to procure the hardware. Customer issues, repeated customer issues in certain areas might pop up. There's an area in your REST API that was documented, but it's confusing, leading to lots of calls and people are sending us emails about. It could be an issue on your site. People have reported there's a search issue, they can't find something. So these are all your problems now, and you're the product owner. What can you do about this? Think about this as a funnel. Visualize all these issues coming down to your queue. Instead of getting overwhelmed, let's attack them in a layer of priority. Let's see how we can invest in the areas having the greatest impacts. The first thing that you can do is to create a strategic approach to approach this. So you have all these different problems. Going back one more, just to remind you of how this was all coming towards you. And then taking a step back to think about, if this was a new feature, if this is an entirely new product, what is the user doing? The basic audience analysis. How did the user, how is the user going to use this API, or how did they end up in the situation that they ran into this problem, and trying to understand that and document it. The next strategic thing that you can do is to combine a few of these things and accomplish them together. You could combine a feature update or an enhancement with some of the other issues that came in the same area. You might have had a lot of questions. So what if I had the metered billing feature? I had to document it. At the same time, I knew that there were a few queries in that area in the pricing model pages in the chapter. I could attack them both together and accomplish multiple goals in one round. The next thing, which is really my favorite, is like the low-hanging fruit. Look at those items that can give you some quick wins. Were there some broken links, a quick note that you had to add somewhere, a few confusing sentences that had to be reworded or deleted, a title that could be improved, adding a section, small little things that can give you some quick wins that you can immediately show to your management. The next one is list all the areas where that have extensive customer usage. Let's say there's an issue in the order. So I'm taking this example of the restaurant where every day you take orders. So the order is the most extensively used feature versus a customer or an employee, which you might have to enter once in a while. So if I have lots of issues in the orders area and I know that this is going to be a blocker or going to be a repeat problem and reduce sales, then I would address my problem in the orders area first and then prioritize that over others. Identify areas with learning problems. Like my REST API is a good example of that. We had a documentation, but it's still confusing and we need to do something about that. It is also helpful while you're looking at high priority items to look at the low priority items. What are the lowest priority? What are the areas in your product or the features which are least used, or the areas in your doc that are least used? If those low priority areas are your stale docs, could you hide them, or could you just ignore them and leave them for the time being? Something to think about. How can I be a doc product owner? A quick idea is to have a roadmap, and a roadmap doesn't have to be anything complicated. It can be really simple. Depending on the complexity and the projects in your team, the roadmap can roll up to the team level. But at your individual product level, you can also communicate and create a simplified vision of how you want to approach and tackle all these problems. You own these areas, you own the problems, and you have a plan of how you would do this. So communicating that vision with all the inputs that we've been gathering in the previous slides. Prioritizing the backlog, we talked about this, the small and the bigger items. Take the items at the top of your list and which have the greatest impact, the greatest investment areas, and execute those first. Let your management know that you've got these done. Then look at continuously improving things over time, collecting feedback, strategically using that feedback in the next iteration or the next update that you were going to make, and kind of aligning it with everything else that you were going to work on. This is a very simple example of how you can communicate a roadmap and taking it off that list that I had. I had a list of issues. I had 5 different issues in my queue. And I decided that the first item, which is the metered billing feature, which I know increases revenue and has impact, needs to be documented. I tackle that first, and then I move on to the customer pain point of the REST API and the chapter that needs an update. The next thing is the hardware launch, which is driven by its own launch deadlines. So back calculating how long back, how many weeks a developer needs a heads up to get their apps tested on this new device. I put the new feature, the whole new API at number 4, because I want to tackle it in parts. My first part is going to be identifying what is the MVP. If this is a new API, can I provide a fully reviewed API reference with meaningful type endpoint names and details and examples, not examples, valid values and everything that is needed for a developer to use this API. And then in the next iteration, I can start working on the tutorials and best practices. And I can also take the input that came from people using this API already. So it kind of allows me to attack multiple problems at the same time. The fifth thing I thought was the searchability issue that I need to look into. This was my order of priority based on what I learned and the data that I was able to gather. But it's a simple way of communicating exactly how you want to address all the issues in your area. Being a product owner empowers you to actually think about this and make some decisions based on data and communicate it. The goal for me is, and for which I have found as an owner, it's always been helpful to get involved right from the beginning. At Oracle, we were involved throughout the process because we were one team doing all the functions, and it's different in different organizations. But getting involved in the requirement definition, what are the features being scoped in this release? Knowing that ahead of time has always helped. Being involved in the functional reviews or in the design review meetings, providing early input, asking questions, creating your own design document if that's a thing you do, especially for new and complex features, writing it, testing it, working with your stakeholders to review and provide input, and planning your go-to-market strategy. So it's not just the feedback, listening to customers, balancing the ongoing changes, investments, planning your go-to-market, meaning release notes, what's new, whatever whatever language you use within your organization, to tell your customers the new features and how they can use it and how they can succeed. Your documentation is something that matures over time. So don't worry about meeting 110% in the first draft. Get the bare minimum out, gather feedback, and as time goes on, the needs change, the industry also changes. So you can be more dynamic in being able to absorb these changes and really increase the value, the customer value of your documentation. Continuously releasing incremental but small improvements and helping customers, listening to customers and taking their input into whether it was a feedback they provided about your docs, saying that this was confusing and you actually addressed that and made it better, or works as much to engage them just as if they had requested for a new feature and they saw the feature come up in the next few releases. Just getting them engaged and making them part of the process helps build better documentation, helps you think like a product owner, and helps you better deal with the whole dilemma, the funnel that we saw of all the different requests coming your way. So instead of getting overwhelmed, tackle it as if you were the owner and you own the problem. What would you do? How would you prioritize it? Use data to make these decisions and communicate that. So that's the end, and thank you all for listening. And I can take some questions. I have a few links, my blog, LinkedIn, etc., and also my volunteers.
Thanks, Rhea. Thanks for that. I don't see any questions in the chat, but if anyone's got any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions. I personally like the way you've elaborated the roadmap for the documentation. I think that was really clever, trying to get a, prioritizing your documentation based on the relevance. So, yeah.
I don't see any questions
Yeah, I don't
on the
think so.
chat.
I think everyone's pretty happy with that.
Hopefully I didn't overwhelm everyone.
No, it's all good. So thanks for your time, Shreya. That's been really lovely. So we'll jump on to Lana. Lana, if you want to share your screen. We can't hear you, Lana, if you're speaking.
Shall we try that instead?
Yes.
That
Yep.
better?
Success. Yep.
I'll revert to the cheap headset every single time. Okay. Share this. How does that look?
Perfect. Over to you.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, most of you probably have already realized I'm not Lucas Costi. So thank you for allowing me to step in at the very last minute, and my best wishes to Lucas. I hope he's feeling better real soon. And a quick note on this talk that it was actually written for open source developers at LinuxConf4U, but I am hoping that it translates fairly well. Usually I would have taken the time to go through and address that focusing a little bit, but unfortunately I haven't had time to do it. So you're getting it in its raw form as it was for LinuxConf4U. I'd like to begin, just before I get going, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the Yagara land on which I'm giving this presentation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I would also like to acknowledge that this land, which I benefit from occupying, was stolen, and that sovereignty was never ceded by the Yagara people. So I think most of you have been to a talk I've given before or know me in some fashion, so I'm not going to bore you with my resume. I do want to talk a little bit about where I'm coming from in this talk, though. I consider myself an open source technical writer because I've primarily worked on documentation suites that exist in an open source environment. By that, I mean documentation that has its source and usually its toolchain generally available to the public, and that accepts bug reports and pull requests from the community. In most cases, there has been some kind of a community around the project I've been documenting, which means there needs to be a certain level of community engagement involved in both development of the code and development of the documentation. However, in most cases, I have contributed to documentation within a corporate context. That is, I've been paid by a company to write documentation for a project that is important to them. Of course, there are instances where I have contributed to various documentation projects in my spare time because either it's something I'm passionate about, but the majority of documentation I've been written about has been open source projects working for an enterprise sponsor. So this talk has been written primarily for people who are working on open source documentation suites, whether or not they're directly employed by a corporate enterprise to do so. However, it should hopefully be useful to you if you need to assess documentation in any context. And I have tried to provide perspective on doing this within a corporate environment as well as within an open source community. So that's the boring bit. I've gotten that out of the way. Let's get to the fun part. So, like your lockdown sourdough, it is easy to be enthusiastic about documentation when you get started. You're going to write docs. They're going to be great. You're going to write all those things down that other writers miss out. And before you know it, you have a very large markdown file with a lot of words in it. And you're probably trying to ignore it. So I don't know anything about sourdough starters, but I can actually help you find out if the words are any good. So let's find out. The first step is to gather the goods, and I mean all of them. And on this screen, you'll notice there's a little icon there of a phone that indicates that this might be a good one for you to screenshot if you're interested. So I know there's a bit of what you have that you think of as the docs, but there's probably more that you don't necessarily think of as docs that needs to be included too. So start in the repo, think about release notes, code comments, the source code itself, GitHub commit messages, and changelogs. Then you can take a look at the more commercial and marketing stuff you have. Things like blog posts, white papers, website copy, any articles you've written, talks you've given, email threads, basically any conversations you've had with people outside your project. And if your project is big enough to have any kind of sales or support, there'll be a wealth of info there for you as well, in the form of pitches, knowledge bases, forums, and support conversations. So part of this is to think about what you're writing about. Are you writing about something pretty simple that people can use without having any experience, like a toaster? Most people presented with a toaster for the first time would be able to work out how to use it without having anyone show them. You know, you put the bread in the bread-shaped hole at the top, you push the lever and you wait for it to finish. Because the thing you were writing about is pretty simple and straightforward, you might think that you don't need much documentation, but just because you might not need a lot of docs, you will still need something. And working that out can actually be quite tricky for a simpler product. You are going to need to think a little bit harder about who you're writing for. But maybe you're writing about something a bit complicated that people can only start to use only after they've done a bit of reading, and they might need to ask some questions as they go along. I like to think about this as being a bit more like a car. No one can really get in a car and for the first time and just drive. But just about everyone can drive once they've had some instruction and a fair bit of practice. For most people, driving becomes second nature after a while, and you can do it while holding a conversation or singing along to the radio without any trouble. But remember, we all started out with that white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel, trying to remember to steer, work the pedals, indicate, look at road signs, and not crash into anyone all at the same time. I have a learner driver in my house at the moment. I'm rediscovering this quite a lot at the moment. So when you're writing for a product that's something more like a car, there's a pretty good chance that you needed to learn how to do this thing yourself. And hopefully it wasn't all that long ago. You can fairly easily cast your mind back to those days when you didn't know what this thing was or how it worked. And hopefully there is also someone nearby who has had to learn fairly recently as well. So you should go and ask them questions. But maybe you are writing about something really tricky, something that requires training, a whole lot of background knowledge, a trainer to help them the whole way, regular refreshers over time. This is more like operating a nuclear reactor. The first thing to work out if you were writing about a nuclear reactor is what reasonable assumptions can you make. There's a fair chance that you can assume at least some kind of prior knowledge, either a degree, some relevant experience, or perhaps some other related tools or software. Put those assumptions right up front in your docs so your readers can go away and learn something else first if they need to. And be prepared to be challenged. You might discover in time that your assumptions are incorrect. And if that happens, you'll need to revisit your docs as well. So that was the first step. Second step is to forget everything that we've just talked about and have a think about who is reading. So just for a moment, put everything aside and have a look into your product from the outside. Now, this can be really difficult to do, and there's a good reason for that. If you've ever been really good at something and tried to show someone else how to do it, you'll know that it can be really frustrating when people just don't seem to get it, even though it seems really easy to you. Science and research tells us that the more we know about a topic, the less able you are to imagine what it's like to not know it. One of the many technical names for this phenomenon is called the curse of knowledge, and it does make writing documentation quite hard. Writers always start by putting themselves in the shoes of the reader, but the curse of knowledge makes it really difficult. So it is important to take this step seriously and to really try and be honest with yourself about the things you discover. So for example, If you're trying to work through a new installation as a reader might, it's easy to think that the next step is intuitive, but you need to ask yourself if it's intuitive because you wrote the software or you're very familiar with the process, but is it really intuitive? Add to this the problem that discovering something you wrote or have had a hand in is not intuitive or is not very good can be really irritating and possibly upsetting thing to learn. So it can be a really difficult process to go through. And I appreciate how difficult that can be. The first thing to do is to really think hard about who is reading your docs. The simple answer to this is our users, but that's actually a bit of a cop-out. There is a reason that most technical writers use the term readers rather than users for the people who use the product they create. So users use software, and readers read documentation. And while that Venn diagram overlaps, it's not a circle. Your readers are not always, or sometimes not even mainly, your users. Depending on your product, you may find that sales and support staff use your docs more than end users do, which is the case in a lot of professional contexts. In the open source world, you probably find that people read your docs, to determine if they want to be involved in your community, or if they want to use your product in their own project, or if they might want to fork your project for some reason. These readers cannot necessarily be considered users, and it's important that we write documentation that is appropriate for them as well as for the users. Now, I'm going to tell you a secret. No one curls up at night with a warm drink and a great technical manual. And if that's the case, why do people read docs? Generally speaking, it's because they want to achieve something, but that's really abstract. To put it in less abstract terms, you need to work out what problem your reader is trying to solve. So there's a common quote that says something like, people don't buy a drill because they need a drill, they buy a drill because they need a hole. When it comes to documentation, I say you need to go a step further and ask why they need a hole. So let's say my friend Alex is at the local hardware store looking at drills. What kind of information would help them here? There's a pretty good chance that when Alex woke up this morning, they didn't think, you know what? I don't have a drill. I should go out to Bunnings today and buy one. What is more likely is that they woke up this morning and thought something like, oh, I should hang that picture on my office wall, or I should install that shelving unit. So the content that Alex needs is probably not called how to choose a drill. The documentation they need is how to hang a picture. This is an important distinction because if you get it wrong, your readers won't know if the content is right for them, or worse, they won't find your content at all. So one of the non-user reader types that is really common in just about all projects is that of the user to be. This is someone who is considering using your product but has not yet started. This person doesn't know how to work it. They need to know how it works. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on that later on, but for now, let's just remember that different readers require different things, often from the same documentation. Now, it's really easy to sit around and have a think about who the readers might be, but it's even better if you can go out and find out for real. Get in contact with your readers in any way you can, but my preferred method is to start with a series of one-on-one interviews with people you already know. In an open source community, you can usually reach out to your top contributors and users pretty easily, and you might have a board or a core team that you can rely on to get you to the right people. In a corporate environment, I would start with sales, TAMs, and consulting staff. You can then use the information you get from these interviews to create a short survey to send out to the wider community mailing lists. This serves a few purposes. The first reason is that you get direct feedback on your current docs. There's a good chance you'll find out some truths about your docs, but it's even more likely that you'll have some suspicions confirmed about the pain points, which is great because now you have data to back up why you're making changes and you have a much better story to tell about the improvements. But the second reason is more long-term. You might not get any advantage now, but in the weeks and months to come, when someone notices a problem in a document, they're more likely to think, hold on, someone was asking about this recently. Who was that? And they'll come and find you. So it actually builds engagement in the long term. It's also really important to understand what your readers actually want, rather than what you think they might want. Our developers kept telling us that we needed more quick start information. But when we asked our readers, they all said they wanted more explanation of how things worked, not just step-by-step procedures. Both of those things are about getting started, sure, but in terms of the content we needed to write, they were quite different. By the same token, you also need to find out if readers actually want what they say they want. One piece of feedback we got from a reader was to, quote, stop moving things around. This was really interesting to us because when we dug deeper into the problem, it turned out that people found the documentation so difficult to navigate that they were saving hard links to the content they needed, and if we moved things, those links broke. The problem was not so much that we were moving things around, but that they couldn't find the stuff they needed within our docs in the first place. In the end, the solution to that was to improve the navigability of the site, to implement a really good site search mechanism, and to get more consistency in our section headings and procedure titles, so it was clearer what was in each section. Now, even though what we did was move everything around a whole lot, we don't get that feedback anymore. So we're up to the third step. Work out what's important, and to do this we use a user task analysis. Now, a lot of technical writers like to do user task analysis to work out what content needs to be prioritized. You can spend a huge amount of time on user task analyses if you're going to do them properly, but you don't really need to go into that much detail. It's really just a way to validate what you probably already have in your head by now. So to do this, you need to have an idea of who your readers are and the things your readers want to describe. The lists don't need to be exhaustive, but you should be able to group most of them into some broad categories that cover the spectrum of readers and tasks. So thinking about the reader types first, the way you categorize your readers is up to you, but sometimes the best way to start is by thinking of a beginner, an intermediate reader, and an expert. Or depending on the kind of product you have, you might think of an ordinary user, a system administrator, and a support person. Your three readers should probably be interested in different parts of the product. They will be trying to do different tasks, and they will need different levels of help from your docs. Don't be afraid to let them overlap a little bit, but try and make sure you've covered most of the options. In this example that I'm about to give you, we've got system admin, sales, and support, but you could easily include developers, hobbyists, executives, or any number of others. So let's think about what our readers are trying to achieve. For each of your readers, start by thinking about how they might begin. What's the very first thing they might want to do? Let's assume that they managed to complete that without any trouble. What's the second thing that they would want to do? And now they've managed to complete that, what's the next thing? Again, you don't need to be exhaustive here, but make sure you cover the big ticket items, things like installing, configuring, troubleshooting, that kind of thing. So once you have those things, you can put them in a little table like this, and you can work out how likely it is that a particular reader will use the documentation to do each task. If you put the reader types across the top of your table and all the tasks down the side, you get a great matrix that looks like this one. Obviously, this is only the first few lines. You would probably have more tasks down the side, but hopefully this gives you an idea. You can fill out each square on the table with the likelihood that each reader type will use the docs to do each task. And note the really important thing here. You're not asking if system administrators are likely to do a product installation, because of course they are. You're asking if system administrators are likely to use the documentation to do a product installation. The answer to that is a little bit trickier, and it depends on things like how easy your product is to install, how often a system admin might do that task. So when you have all the boxes filled out, you can do some simple maths and score a 3 for a high likelihood, 2 for a medium, and 1 for a low likelihood. That gives each task a score. The higher the number, the more critical the documentation for this task is. So in the example here, you can see that product research scores a 6 because it's only really important to one group, but managing clients scores a 9 because it's important to everyone. That means we know to spend more time and effort on documenting how to manage clients, and we can improve the general product info later on. So the fourth step is to match what you have to what you need and work out what the gaps are. So the highest scoring things in your user task analysis in your table are called critical paths. The items with the highest critical path score is the content that's most important for you to write. All of this doesn't mean that the lower ranked things aren't important, of course. This is just about finding where you need to focus. So if you find that your focus points are not adequately covered in your existing docs, then you have an immediate gap that you've located. But before you start writing them, you need to have a think about what content type each of these things requires. Earlier, we talked about different readers needing different content. I said something like this. This person doesn't need to know how to work it, they need to know how it works. To demonstrate what I mean by that, I want you to consider a giant red button that has the word stop on it. If you want to understand how to work this, the content needs to say something like, press the stop button to shut down the process. If you want to understand how it works, you need something more like, when the stop button is pressed, a signal is sent to the machine to immediately stop all running processes. The processes will stop completely within 5 seconds. So in the first example, the explanation is suitable for someone who wants to stop the machine and needs to know how. It answers the question, how do I do it? In the second example, the content is suitable for someone who needs to understand how the machine works, and it answers the question, what is it? To make this a little bit easier to get your head around, we can categorize all content into one of 3 content types. Everyone has their own way of thinking about these, so I'm going to give you a couple of different definitions for each one, and hopefully at least one of them really sticks for you. So the first one is a concept. Concepts describe how and why something works. Concepts answer the question, what is it? When readers read concepts, they're engaging in a learning behavior and reading about a topic to understand it. Concepts are designed for people who are unfamiliar with a topic to get enough understanding about what the thing is so they can start being productive with it. Some tech writers also like to consider what shape a content type has on the page. So if you imagine what a concept would look like if you were too far away to read the actual words, it would look something like this picture. That is, it's generally paragraphs of ordinary prose sentences. Every single time you write something, you should start with a concept. If the concept is simple, it could be 1 sentence, but a more complicated concept could go for many pages. You need to write as much as you need to get the concept across. So the second is tasks. Tasks give specific instructions about how to get something done. Tasks answer the question, how do I do it? When readers read tasks, they're engaging in a doing activity. Think about your readers having your task open to one side and they're doing the thing in front of them. So they can read a step and perform the action immediately before going on to the next step. Tasks tend to have a specific goal and consist of a set of numbered steps that the reader can follow to achieve that goal. The shape of a task on the page looks like this picture. It usually has a title, although there's not one in this picture. Usually has a title and it's followed by numbered steps. The numbered steps are the important part here. The third and final content type is reference. References contain structured information or specifications that users need to make a product work. Reference material answers the question, what else do I need to know? When readers read references, they're engaging in fact-checking behavior, and it's usually looking up information, either to determine a definition or an explanation for something or to refresh their memory. Reference sections comprehensively catalog data such as functions and their parameters, return codes, error messages, that kind of thing. The generally accepted shape of a reference looks like a table. Tables are the most common shape for references, but because they're a little bit of a catch-all, they can also be bulleted lists, definition lists, or sample scripts as well. So now that we understand the content types, you should be able to arrange your docs so that you have concepts at the top, followed by the related tasks. At the end of each section, you include reference material. It's really important to note here that the 3 content types shouldn't be intertwined. They should all sit quite separately from each other. And I will go so far as to say there are no exceptions to this rule. Don't ever put concept information into a task or put a task into your reference. If you find yourself doing this, you need to go back and reorganize things. So now I'm hoping you have a list of critical paths. You have some idea of what content type each critical path requires. This is your to-do list. So the fifth step is probably the hardest step. It's about making the dream match reality. You will need to be realistic about what you can achieve and face the fact that you might not have the resources or the will to get things perfect. If you're upfront about this with yourself, it helps you to avoid being terribly disappointed later on. This also, incidentally, works well for your New Year's resolutions. So say you wanted to get fit in 2021 and work off all that sourdough you ate during lockdown. You wouldn't just start weighing yourself weekly and hoping. You would start by planning your diet, working out what exercise you can do and what fitness goals you want to achieve. You need to think about what you intend for your documentation before you get started. Is it going to be comprehensive and detailed or simple and sparse? Is it going to use simple language designed for people who've never done this before, or more technical language for people who know what they're doing and just need the basics? Is it going to start from the very beginning, or are you going to assume that your readers already have some kind of related knowledge? And remember that if you make assumptions, you need to state them up front and make sure that you're prepared to go back and readjust them if needed too. So by now, you should have a good idea of what your ideal documentation looks like. It will, of course, be a shining beacon of docs goodness, hitting all the critical paths for all your readers, and people will talk about it for years to come. But it's a grim reality that project documentation needs to be maintained, no matter how good it is. Have a think about how many writers your project might be able to access. Are you likely to have writers on the project over time? What skill level are they likely to have? Is there any content that already exists elsewhere that you can point to rather than writing it yourself? Is there any way you can automate any part of the documentation, such as using code comments to generate API docs? Now is when you really get to start making decisions. You've thought about your readers and the kinds of things they might want to do. You've thought about the kind of content you already have and what's missing. Then you faced reality and realized that you might not be able to create perfect docs, but you can certainly improve what you already have. Now that dream matches reality, you can make reality match the dream. Don't let your docs projects be like your New Year's resolutions, forgotten and lonely by the end of the year. The best way to make sure you stick to your docs goals is to work out how much you can do and set a deadline for each step in the process. Once you have an idea for what you need to write, you can split up docs work like this. Planning's 20%, drafting 50%, reviewing and editing 20%, production 10%, and a final little retrospective at the end. So, for example, if you want to write a how-to and you have 5 months to do it, you can work out how much time to spend on each task. I've chosen 5 months because it's a nice, neat 100 working days. That's if you're working 5 days a week and you're allowing for a few holidays. So obviously you can adjust this however you like, depending on whether, let's say, if you're only working weekends, for example, or if you have other projects to work on as well. So planning would be 4 weeks, drafting would take 10 weeks, reviewing and editing would take 4 weeks, production 2 weeks, and you do a retrospective afterwards. The most important thing about planning documentation work is that you need, what you need to do is to be flexible. Things don't always work out, and that's okay. Perhaps you get a new job and you end up with no time to work on it. If you've written down your plan and spoken to others in your project about what you were going to do, others can pick up that work. And when you're able to, you can come back to it. Perhaps you get an injection of cash and you can hire some writers. It might happen, let's face it. Go back to the critical paths, expand your scope, hand that planning to them so that they have somewhere to start and they understand your vision for the docs. Or maybe things just don't work out and the project ends up being abandoned entirely. That's sad, but it's okay. At least you've finished with some valuable knowledge and you'll be even better for your next idea. So now there's just one thing left to do. Your dream matches reality, so now it's time to make reality match the dream. Go ahead and start writing. If you're interested in revisiting some of the content that I've gone through here, including the amazing cartoons that my niece drew for me here, go and check out the interactive information architecture guide that I wrote for the Good Docs project. You can find it at the URL on your screen, which is the gooddocsproject.dev/ia-guide. Of course, there's also lots of other great advice and documentation templates in the Good Docs project. I strongly suggest you go and check it out. So thank you for listening, everyone.
Wow, thank you. Thanks a lot for that, Lana. That has been really, really informative. Sorry, I've just got one question in the chat from Alec. So how should you modify the plan when working with a developer team with 2-week sprints, for example? So I think more in the agile space.
So I talk a little bit about agile documentation in other talks that I've done, including the Write the Docs conference talk that I gave for Australia. Was that in January? I can't remember when it was. Whenever the Australian Write the Docs conference was, go and check out the recording for that. I speak about agile stuff more there. This is more for that taking a step back and assessing what's going on. I wouldn't recommend that you necessarily work like this on a day-to-day rolling basis, but I am always happy to talk more about agile documentation, but it is literally a whole nother talk.
Yep.
I don't want to take up too much time here.
No, it's all good. Thank you. So if anyone's got any other questions, feel free to unmute yourself. You can ask Lana directly.
Oh, I see Cameron dropped the Good Docs project link in. Thanks for that, Cameron. I knew I could count on you.
Great. So if no one's got any questions, we'll call it close to that meetup event today. Thank you again, Shreya and Lana, for your for sharing your experiences. And yeah, we've got a couple of comments around how, from Chetan. He said, I like how the talks complement each other. And yeah, love the themes and the colors that you always use in your presentation slides. They're superb.
I just like bright colors, quite honestly.
Yeah. They look really good. So yeah, thank you, everyone. I'll make this recording available on the Write the Docs AU YouTube channel, and I'll also post it on the actual at the end of the event in the comments. So yeah, feel free to have a look at that. And if anyone's got any topics that they'd like to present on, feel free to get in touch with me on LinkedIn or through the meetup event. So thank you very much, and yeah, we'll chat up soon later.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.